It's a real delight to be here in Brighton, of all places, a city that's really vibrant and alive with ideas, with change, with innovation, and also kind of poignant that we're talking about climate change, because Great Britain spawned the Industrial Revolution, and here we are 200 years later having to deal with the consequences, the unintended consequences of that revolution. And it's been interesting to see how humanity has reached this sort of critical point. And we've really got to change things. And when I wrote a book about this about 6 years ago, I figured we've got about 30 years before the crisis would hit. And I honestly think it's 15 years. So the science is really clear that the window is narrowing. The time to act is now, and one of the themes that came out of COP26 is we need action now, and it's no more blah, blah, blah. So, and if we don't take action in the next 15 years, Mother Nature will extract a very severe penalty for humanity's actions and our inactions. So we've got to step forward and do something, but the question is, what do we do? Now, one of the reasons it's difficult, because climate change is incredibly complicated, really, really complicated. And in academia, there's a word for super complex issues. They're called wicked issues. So not wicked in the sense of being evil, but wicked in the sense that they are so complicated, they almost seem intractable, impossible to solve. And what can one person do? And so the book I wrote 6 years ago was called Wicked and Wise, How to Solve the World's Toughest Problems. And so that book and some of the books I've written since is trying to offer hope to the world that there are some things that we can do. And one of the first things we need to do is to understand the nature of the wicked problems that we're dealing with. So there are 6 characteristics that define all wicked problems. So first of all, they're all multidimensional. They have multiple causes, multiple symptoms, multiple stakeholders, and therefore they need multiple solutions, and they're constantly evolving. So just when we begin to think we're getting a grip of the issue, it changes. So a little bit like COVID mutating. Just when you think you're getting it, it morphs into something else. So we've really got to think very carefully about that if we're going to have any hope for creating a new story. And what I'm not going to talk about is what everybody else at COP has talked about, and as many other people, many activists and many scientists, talking really about the things that we need to do out there in the world. So I'm not going to talk about deforestation or carbon capture and storage or methane or any of those, or the technologies or any of those things. Even those things are unbelievably important. You know, we've got to follow protocols, we've got to have agreements, we've got to follow process. All of that stuff is really, really critically important, but it's out there. It's in the world of doing. What do we need to do? What are the technologies and the processes that we need to follow? So I'm not going to talk about that. That's what we call the world of it. I want to talk to you about 2 other worlds, the world of I and the climate in here, and the world of we and the culture in here. Because without addressing that, and this is something that really isn't much addressed at COP, which is what's happening inside me as a human being. As I, grow up, we've heard from parents, what happens inside our children, the I change. Because it's going to take me to change me, and you to change you, and us to change us, for us to have any hope of solving these problems. It's not just a series of tasks and targets and protocols and agreements. That won't be enough. There has to be individual human change and human development, and there has to be cultural change and cultural development. That is the only sustainable way forward. And that's what we mean by multidimensional, the 3 dimensions of I and we and it. All 3 need to evolve. So I want to talk to you about that predominantly, and not least because the complexity that exists is so massive. And one of the things that happens with the complexity is humanity, because society is evolving and becoming more complicated, we're creating many, many of these wicked issues. So we've just come out of a pandemic. A pandemic, COVID, is itself a wicked issue. It started in the wet markets of Asia, as a virus jumped from bats and pangolins into into humans. And we suffered the consequences, but probably the most significant zoonotic disease that you're all aware of was HIV. And that jumped from monkeys into humans in 1920, but it erupted in the mid-80s. And since the mid-80s, 35 million people have died as a result of HIV. And in the mid-80s, we've also seen another zoonotic disease where a prion jumped from that causes mad cow disease, jumped from cows into humans, and everybody that was infected died on a much smaller scale. And then in 2002, we had SARS, which jumped from civets, kind of like a little stoat animal, into humans. And that went global. And then we had Ebola, which jumped from bats and monkeys and gorillas into humans. So this is another wicked problem. And this causes these pandemics, and they will keep happening because there's a problem with the global food safety and security, right? In fact, there's a problem with the global food system. So we're currently living on the planet where 2 billion people are starving. 2 billion. At the same time as 2 billion people are suffering with obesity at the same time, right? Which is kind of weird. We're wasting 40% of all the food we produce, and we're also, if we're going to feed 8.5 billion people who are going to be on the planet by 2030, we're going to have to up food production by 60%. So it's not just climate change, right? It's also the global food system. I mean, there are many of these wicked problems, predominantly because they're problems of humanity. They're problems of society. There's lots of them, So we're going to have to lean into all these. I mean, pick your favorite and have a go, And they all affect each other because they all interact. So we've got to look more widely. Now, I'm not trying to depress you. Probably doing a quite good job at the moment, right? So I'm not trying to depress you with this, but the first thing you've got to do in order to solve any of these problems is face the truth. If we don't face the truth, so we've got to stop kidding ourselves. We've got to stop kidding ourselves that we're moving fast enough, that we're doing enough. We're just not. Now, one of the bits of hope is the speed of change. And there's something called knowledge doubling. Now, knowledge was doubling for humanity. The entire knowledge base of humanity was doubling every 100 years in 1900. And by 1945, it was doubling every 25 years. By 1980, it was doubling every year. Today, knowledge is doubling every 12 hours. So that means everything we know about climate change today, by tomorrow, will only be half of what's known. And in 3 days' time, will only be 12% of what is known about climate change. So one of the great hopes for the future is the speed of that change, right? So, and part of that speed comes from us changing. So that's kind of what I want to talk to you about is the levels of I development. So here's your first climate scientist. You might remember this person. So climate science starts at this age. And the first experiment we all conduct is we look in the mirror and we raise our hand, and the person in the mirror raises their hand. And we put our hand down, and the person puts their hand down, and we put our hand up, and they put their hand up. And oh my goodness, that's me. So that experiment is done by a 1-year-old, and it's a joy to watch when they sudden dawning realization they exist. So before that, they're just pooing and crying, right? And then they exist in the world. And then they do the experiment number 2, where they put their foot in their mouth, and they bite it, and it hurts, right? And then they bite the table. Nothing. Hang on a minute. Bite my foot. Ow, that hurts. I can feel my gums. I can feel my foot. Bite the table. Nothing. So they start to realize, I'm the thing that hurts when you bite it. I.e., this is a realization that we exist as a physical entity. So we become physically separate from our parents or our caregivers. But it's not until we reach 2 years old that we become emotionally separate, which is prior to this happening, you get the terrible twos, right? So you remember this experiment, if you've seen children like this, right, is when a 2-year-old is hungry, the world is hungry, right? And why aren't we eating? Because there's only one emotion here, hunger, right? And so it's mum, meat, food, now. Incredibly egocentric. And then around about 2 years old, again, this is a beautiful moment. If you see it, you'll see it in the supermarket with this 2-year-old child bawling with rage because they want the chocolate. Why aren't we getting the chocolate? I want the chocolate. And they look baffled at you, going, why aren't you crying? We want the chocolate. And they're sort of baffled. And what that really is emotional separation. So we, first of all, become physically separate and separate entities from our parents, and then we become emotionally separate. And then the third level of our development is when we become conceptual beings. Now, this might start at 9 months, and the main thing that happens here is language. And language is just a concept. It's a noise to represent something. So the noise head means this: shoulders, knees, and toes, right? These are just noises to represent something. So concept is the main thing that happens. So we start to label the universe. This is where the universe starts to make sense. We start to label our environment: tree, flower, dog, cat, sun, moon. So we start to navigate and make sense of the universe, right? But it's not until we get to the 4th level of development, usually blossoms around 6 to 9 years old, where we start to learn the rules that govern the concept. So why is a dog and a cat a cat? And we start to learn that. And, as a result of that, we start to follow the rules. And this is where most human beings stop. So most of the adults you meet are still at this level. Those that like cosplay, right? And things like that. So, you'll see this very, very much. A lot of the adults might be 30, 40, 50 or more on the outside, but on the inside, about 8, right? And you can measure it. I'm not being pejorative. You can measure these things. Now, the first attempt to get beyond 8 years old happens in early teenage years. You become transpersonal, a little bit less egocentric, as you start to realize there's something existing beyond your own egocentric sense of self. So when you're 12, you start to become concerned about the universe and the environment. That's when that kicks in for the first time, right? Is you really, it's not all about this. And in these teenagers, this is where you get teenage conflict, right? Why do I have to be home at 11? Why can't I be home at 11:30? Right? And parents try to suppress and repress that, and a battle breaks out, right, between parents and children, not realizing don't suppress that, it's a developmental stage. You shouldn't be suppressing that stuff. They're just trying to figure out the rules. Now, regardless of who wins that battle, sometimes it's the mother, sometimes it's the child, but when human beings leave home, a much bigger parent called society, right, starts to impose much more powerful rules and pushes most people from early teenage back to sleep into the concrete consciousness. And so most people go back to sleep. And we forget about the environment. And we forget about the importance of the planet because we've kind of got a developmental regression. And that's where most people live, right? So most of the people you'll encounter are either 8 years old or 14 years old. They might be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 on the outside, but on the inside, totally different game, right? And so what we have to do as human beings is we have to wake up. We have to wake up from this, because if we can get into transpersonal and stabilize, there are another 5 levels of adult development to be unlocked. And that's our chance for saving the planet. Is if we can unlock these other levels, we start to realize the error of our ways. And without that, we'll never take urgent enough decisions to change anything. And then one final thing I wanted to say is that in addition to us waking up and owning up and growing up, we have to look at ourselves in relationship to the ecosystem that we're in. So as a physician, it's sort of interesting to me when you think about, well, who are we really? So if you look at the cells in the human body, 90% of all the cells in the human body are actually bacterial cells. So we're actually bacteria. 90% of all our cells are bacteria. We're only 10% human, right? So we're basically a bacteria in a human coat, right? If you look at DNA, right, we've got 30,000 human genes in the body, but 3 million bacterial genes. So we're only 1% human if we look at DNA. And a lot of that bacterial DNA is viral DNA. So human beings are basically bacteria in a human coat, deeply plugged into the ecosystem of viruses. This is who we are. And the most successful species on the planet, human beings of bacteria, are successful because we collaborate. So if we can collaborate more effectively, and we can grow up individually and grow up as a community, the speed with which we can transform the it, which is badly broken, will itself transform. So I wanted to just insert that back into the debate. There has to be an I development and a we development for the it transformation that we all seek. So thank you very much.